Over the years, I have gone back and forth with myself as to whether or not I should get an actual food dehydrator, or if I should implement some other alternative to dry my food. With a food dehydrator, you are able to refine and control the internal environment, climate, and temperature so that you don't cook or burn your food, and that it dries as effectively and efficiently as possible. However, some food dehydrators, especially the higher quality ones, may be somewhat cost prohibitive, and also the ones that are more affordable might not always be that great of an option. And so what I've settled on for right now is really focusing on using what I have available. And what I have available right now is an oven. So I decided to experiment with turning this oven into a makeshift dehydrator. Now, of course, I can turn it back into an oven when not using it as a food dehydrator. So, you know, it's like dual purpose. The other advantage of using an oven, particularly if you already have one, is that you have it, right? You don't have to go out and buy something new. So here right now I'm going to break down how I went through this process of using an oven as a food dehydrator and some important key elements to keep in mind so that it is successful and you don't end up with burnt, charred food. Dehydrating food or drying food is something that I find very, very valuable, right? If you freeze food, you have to keep it frozen and keep it cold enough for during the winter time, right? So that uses up a lot of energy to consistently preserve that food throughout that time. You know, whereas if you dry it, you use some energy up front to dry it, unless if you're sun drying certain things, right? But if you're using an oven or a dehydrator, you are using some energy up front to dry the food, but then once it's dry, you can store it at room temperature and you don't have to use any additional energy input to keep that food preserved once it is dried. And many of these dried or dehydrated foods can last fairly long amounts of time. So that's why I want to use the oven as a dehydrator, to save money, to be able to preserve food effectively. So that's the why. But how do we go about turning this oven into a dehydrator? Well, good news, it's actually really simple, but there are a few pointers to keep in mind, right? One thing is that most ovens should have ledges on their internal walls that should be able to fit for multiple racks. I know for the oven that I have, it can fit about 5 or 6 racks in it. I have 4 oven racks that I can use. 2 of them came from the stove. 2 of them came from a different stove that ended up getting scrap metaled. Unfortunately, not all oven racks are the same size and of the same dimensions, but a lot of them are really close. The 2 racks that I had, for example, from the other oven that got scrap metaled, that had those racks were a little smaller. So all I did was there is a middle bar that went through each of those oven racks, and it connected to one of the sidebars, so it's just a cut where that bar intersects with that sidebar, and then you can bend that sidebar, that side of the oven rack out just a little bit so that it actually fits into the oven that I have. Then what I did was I had metal screening, right? And so I cut that to size of how big the racks were. I ended up doing it a little bit smaller than the racks because I don't want the edges of the screening, given that they are kind of sharp and stuff, I don't want them to scratch or damage the internal walls of the oven. An additional thing to keep in mind is when the oven is heating up, right? You've turned the oven on and it is in the process of heating up, you want to make sure that you leave the oven door ajar, right? Slightly open so that the moisture and excess heat can escape. So this will help to produce a better quality drying process. So what I do is I take a wooden spoon or a wooden stick and I put it in between the door and the oven to create just a little bit of an airway, a gap, so that that moisture can escape. So the only other thing to really mention here is a conversation about temperature, right? So a lot of ovens, including the oven that I'm using, its lowest setting is 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Unfortunately, that's too hot to dry food, and you'll end up cooking food or burning food quite easily at that level. So what I try to do is when that oven is heating up, and once it hits 130 degrees Fahrenheit mark, I turn it off, right? I turn it off and I let it cool down, and then once it has cooled down, then I turn it on again. It gets to 130, and then I turn it off again and continue that process until the food is dried. For me, I find that 130 degrees works very well. You definitely don't want to go any higher than 140, because then you'll end up cooking the food or burning the food, or a lot of the foods will may become like really hard to use, and they may not necessarily always reconstitute very well in water too, or when heated up, right? So getting to a maximum temperature of 130 or 140 degrees, definitely don't want to go any higher than that. Now sometimes, right, we may have other things on our mind, or we get distracted, or something comes up and we have to take care of it. So I find it's always very helpful, very good to set an alarm, maybe like on my phone or something like that, so that I know how long it's going to take when it's at room temperature to get up to 130, and I'll set my alarm to that time, right? And then the alarm can go off when it reaches 130, and I then remember to turn off the oven. I turn off the oven, right, and the drying process is able to continue and not turn into a cooking process. So using the oven, or at least using my oven with the way it's set up, right, I have to make sure that I am aware, that I keep an eye on it, and I don't forget about it or neglect it, right? But I keep that schedule of once it gets to 130, I turn it off, let it cool down, and then get it up to 130 again, and repeat that process until that food is dehydrated. All right, so there you go. The process of turning an oven into a dehydrator is super simple, and you can turn it back into an oven very easily, very quickly. To use as a dehydrator, it just takes a little bit more attention and a little bit more awareness on my part to make sure that drying process is continuing and nothing is getting too hot or burnt or anything like that. So this season I've been drying parsnips and sunchokes with it a lot, dehydrating them so that I can grind them down into a meal and put them into different types of foods to supplement and add, diversify plants and DNA and different types of fibers that I'm able to incorporate into my diet. So thank you so much for checking out this video. If you have any experience or anything like that of turning your oven into a dehydrator or using it for similar things, feel free to let us know in the comments of if you have any experiences or insights when it comes to drying food. So I look forward to seeing you in a future video. Take care.